Well, welcome to Student Housing Matters. I'm Alton Irwin, your host, and I'm here today with Erik Kocher, who is a principal with Hastings and Chivetta Architects based in St. Louis, Missouri. I've invited Erik to our Student Housing Matters podcast because of some very interesting things his firm is doing to assist colleges and universities in the current environment, namely what they call virtual architecture of enrollment management. I wonder if I can say that 3 times. And social distancing in academic design. I had the privilege to first work with Erik many years ago when I was in development with Capstone Development on our Wellness Center project at Marshall University. So we've kept touch over the years, and he sent an email out, or at least Hastings Chivetta did, about their new programs not too long ago, and I reached out to Erik and said I thought it would be a very interesting thing for our listeners to hear. So Erik, welcome to Student Housing Matters.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and all your followers. This is fantastic.
Well, let's start with taking a little time for you to introduce yourself and just talk briefly about Hastings and Chivetta.
Well, I'll go ahead, and if it's okay, can I start the presentation? We'll do that first because that's got a little bit of information on that. So thank you, Alton. I just thought very briefly, just talk a little bit more about the firm. You mentioned, we met many, many years ago, and we're located in St. Louis, but I wanted to use the introduction of the Architecture of Enrollment Management, something that we've been doing for about 5 or 6 years now, and really spend most of the time or have that fold into our COVID-19, because that's exactly why you'd called me about this opportunity. As architects, we are an unusual firm in that we only do educational projects for both public and private colleges and universities, as well as public and private K through 12. So we're very invested in the educational market. We have a national practice, and of course we have very traditional architectural services, as you know, but we've developed these new services over the last few years. And of course, the COVID-19 response services, literally just in the last 3 months, assisting the numerous clients that we have around the country. We have had the opportunity, I've been with the firm 34 years. We travel all over the country working for colleges and universities, literally from coast to coast. And I've stayed in touch with many of those clients, speaking specifically about what's going to happen with the COVID-19 response. But let me first introduce the concept of Architecture of Enrollment Management. And because it is hard to say 3 times in a row, typically we just call it AEM. a little bit easier.
You didn't tell me that before I began.
I know, I should have told you before we started. But interestingly, this level of service came to fruition because Chris Chivetta, my partner, and myself, we had several years ago college-age students. They've now all matriculated and graduated. They're all employed and working all across the country. But what we found really remarkable was we started going on all these tours with our children, and we were really flabbergasted by how bad some of the tours were. And, any research you do, particularly with a student, but even parents on a tour, you have about 1 hour to make that very important impression when a family and potential student visits your campus. And we really found it remarkable how wide-ranging the tours were and how odd they were sometimes, just in terms of the overall experience. Now, we're architects. So there are professionals in the admissions business that talk about tours and act as consultants, but we took the twist to talk about the experience from the architecture, what you physically saw, walked past, walked on. Was it nice? Was it not nice? Were you showing buildings that were tired? Were you showing your newest facility on campus? Those were the kinds of things that we developed this service from. It's a 4-part service, and the only unique part is, of course, we work directly, typically with the college president or university president. We come and take the tour in a way that it's kind of secret Santa shopping. The president and we don't inform admissions that we're doing what we're doing because we want to be treated just like everybody else. And in fact, we like to mingle in the large groups with the other parents and even talk with parents and students as part of this process that we do.
Do you have a a fake son or daughter in your tour?
Yes, we do. I've had 2 or 3. We use our interns as our students, and of course, this process starts with even the online, how you approach a campus online. And I don't want to get into all the details, but yes, I look like the dad, of course, and of course my kids would agree. I couldn't look more generic and like a father. And then, of course, I bring these interns along. I've used several different ones on the number that we've done. But we do this analysis. We take the tour. We then retake the tour and take pictures and notes. Of course, when we retake the tour, we're not with anyone. And we basically do an analysis of what this tour was about, how was it done. The one thing we're not particularly critical, although we do make notes, of the actual tour guide. But we're really mostly interested in what everybody sees and feels as they move about the campus on this tour. What comes out of this, of course, are a whole series of recommendations of things you could do differently. We prioritize those for the clients. We also do cost estimates in terms of potential improvements that could change the tour. But we also, interestingly, will find, many suggestions that are cost-free. Simply taking a slightly different route on campus. There are a whole series of different pieces that come out of this. What's really interesting, and I just wanted to show an example, I won't speak specifically about the institution, but on their major admissions tour path, down in the left-hand corner is the original before image, their historic building up on the hill. Alton, I think you've been on this campus because you remembered that this building is so old. It was a hospital in the Civil War for Union soldiers. But you can see the original tour was on an asphalt drive, really a service drive across that. The landscaping was such that you couldn't even see this building. They didn't have consistent lighting. And so you can see with some improvements, we removed the road. We did really nice new sidewalks. We opened up this vista. So when you come out of the admissions building, which happens to be the building on the right, you are greeted by this very historic quad. And now you go all the way around, you circle all the way around campus and eventually end up in that historic building as part of your tour. There are also much more simple things. The first visit, we walked up and after parking in the admissions parking lot, the first thing we saw was the map on campus. Turned out that this was one of 3 variations of the map. The map that was handed out in admissions was different from the map on the website, which was different from this dirty old map. And the other welcoming part of this, as you might imagine, look at the trash cans right in front of the map. So we suggested, of course, cleaning up the sign. It was moved closer to the sidewalk. We got rid of the trash cans. And of course, a new map was put in place that was consistent now across all the different platforms they use on campus for advertising the campus and the map. On the way to the admissions building, the signage was on the left. We don't know why. No one on campus could tell us later. They did a new signage package. We moved all the signs to the right side, which would make sense on the right side. And of course, again, it greatly improved the visibility and how you're introduced to this campus. So imagine this is just the first 3 minutes that a parent or parents and a student are walking on from parking to walking. They haven't even gotten to the admissions building yet. And there are all these little kind of funny little things that happen. So
it's really amazing that someone would decide behind a light bulb.
The greatest compliment we ever had was from one of the institution's presidents. Said later, he's been president 15 years on this campus. I've been walking around for the last 5 years talking specifically to my cabinet about the little things we need to do to improve this experience. What we found is, while of course it works for your admissions tour, it also just adds a level of clarity, and it just makes the overall campus feel and look nicer for the students and the faculty and staff on campus as well. So that's also important. In this case, of course, admissions at this institution, we walked into this nice historic building that had not been renovated, and the admissions area was like my grandmother's living room. I mean, it was so not in touch with the institution, out of date. So one of the larger projects as a result of this they undertook was a renovation of that space. And you can see the old historic hallway, which was very charming, but it's been modernized, new lighting, mechanical, new windows into the admission area. So it's those kinds of details that we look at. The 2 graphs on this slide represent this school what we do, of course, we've done this now for about 20 institutions. At the time, this school scored, we do a scoring system about, how did you look? They had our worst score of any of the institutions we had visited and worked for. Interestingly, after 2 years, 2 summers of making these improvements that we suggested, we did both the budgeting and listed the improvements. Again, we prioritized those. You can see we came back 2 years later, and now they are our second highest scoring institution. And that's up against our highest scoring institution also has an endowment which is about 100 times larger than this institution. So they have the resources to have a beautiful campus and a beautiful experience every day. This campus did not have that opportunity, but with an investment, or the original budget we came up with was $1.35 million of improvements that could improve this experience. It was 60 different items. About 20 of them they did, and they really had no cost. The next 20 were about half this number, including the renovation of the admission space. And so in those 2 years, they eventually made all of these improvements. And the second graph at the bottom was look, of course, now admissions knows we were on campus, and so we asked them for historic data. We really wanted to track it and see whether or not there was any positive reflection of what we had done in the visits to campus. Well, you can see they started to go up in 16. We were hoping they'd go up in 17. In fact, they went down. That had to do with a state mandate about giving very large scholarships at the last minute which really worked against this institution. But you can see in 2018, they've had a jump in actually the size of their incoming class. They've had a jump in both projected and actual applicants and visits. That's very important. Everyone always says if you visit campus, you have a much greater chance to matriculate to that campus. And so this was kind of the offering. I've now spoken nationally at several conferences about this opportunity that we provide. And what then caused us to rethink this, of course, is what's happened right now is all visits have been suspended from campus. And so our new version of this, of course, the basic premise is the same, but what we've added to this is a service of actually videotaping, and we have a company that does high-level video productions, commercial grade. And then that experience, after we do the things, we evaluate what needs to be done to improve the experience. We then also provide the production assistance to go ahead and create a video of that. So it's a virtual version of an actual tour on campus.
Erik,
in my research,
can I ask you one question here? Do you have any examples of any of those on your website that our listeners could actually go to and look at?
We don't have the video examples, but there are, and I would have to go back and find them again. There are a couple of campuses that have done this already. So we know some campuses out of the 5,000 campuses. Okay. I found only 2 right now that have done it. We've got one underway, but of course it's not completed yet. But this is this is what's happened now in terms of changing that experience. We've seen lots of virtual tours on websites and admissions, but those were have you ever seen the campus click and move virtual tours where they use a 360 camera? There's not really a student host taking you through campus as they would on a normal tour. So that's the one thing that's a little bit different. A number of institutions have those as kind of a backup in terms of availability for a student or family to actually come to campus. But this led to then kind of the next piece that I wanted to share with you and your listeners about the COVID-19 response. Our research, of course, there's research being relatively all new because we know this event, while starting in China, technically, it's really been introduced in the United States only 2 or 3 months. We know it's had the economic side of the event has been absolutely both fascinating but devastating at the same time, how quickly it came upon us. The impact on higher education and even K through 12 education is still unknown. We've seen some financial schools, or some schools announced what they've lost in just this first spring semester because of rebates and changes to how they're teaching. We don't know yet about how safe it's going to be when we come back in the fall, and even the viability of some, there have been some individuals, 2 individuals in particular, that have done an analysis, which they did several years ago, and they're now kind of repurposing the analysis that suggested before COVID even became a word that we use in our normal vocabulary now, there were institutions, and they had a list that they claimed there could be 200 smaller private colleges or universities that actually go out of business. That number has been increased. So again, all these pressures on higher education, this was kind of a perfect storm moment. Added to that is the nature of the virus itself, and that, if we had normal flu, you have a fever, you stay home, you don't infect individuals. And of course here the big issue is, and they still don't know exactly whether it's 15%, 20%, 30% of individuals they're asymptomatic, they don't even show those symptoms. So, but what we do know, and the graphic that's on the right, which I downloaded from the Center for Disease and Control of Korea, was an example of the impact of close quarters, which you could say could be classrooms, could be meeting spaces. In this case, this was a call center. It was on the 15th floor of about a 30-story building in downtown Seoul. The building had condominiums, offices like this one. It also had retail at the base. And what was fascinating about their analysis of the entire building, this 30-story building, was the outbreak occurred in a call center where you have the most intense, in terms of people sitting next to each other, experience, as well as people on the phone talking their entire day. And what's really remarkable is how it was confined to just that area. There are a few other folks on the other side of the building that were infected. And then there were only about another 5 people in the entire building that had the virus after being tested. So it really is about this close contact. Well, how does this relate to, of course, colleges and universities? Well, students, spend on average about 4 hours a day in the classroom or lab experience. They sometimes spend another 2 or 3 hours in either campus centers or libraries. And of course, then they spend the rest of the time generally or typically in their own residence hall, their room. And so the natural thought was, okay, well, now we need to do something significant, specifically about what are the strategies, what's going to happen in the fall relative to the social distancing that everyone's been talking about. In my reaching out to college presidents and CFOs and other folks at the colleges and universities that we've worked with, no one has the same game plan. Everybody has a different take on it. You've already heard some schools have announced changes in their schedule. Others have changed start dates. There's no playbook for any of the colleges and universities in this country right now, and everybody's kind of at the mercy of the CDC making recommendations, but also your state and also your local community in terms of orders in place and distancing suggestions. What's really unfortunate is when you look specifically at the guidelines developed by the CDC for coming back to campus in the fall, they are suggestions and they're pretty vague. So while they have about a 5 or 6 page document about coming back and what things you need to do as an administration on a college or university campus, really everything's a suggestion, and there's no and you can understand they're not trying to set any major precedent for anyone, because of course I don't think they want to be then responsible for perhaps suggesting something that doesn't potentially work. So what we've also found is, and I just checked yesterday, getting prepared to talk to you today, they've been updating these suggestions, these guidelines practically every other day. So our whole team here is reading them regularly. The one specifically for higher education was updated on Saturday. That's how new the information is. They continue to add to that information. So I thought in terms of sharing some of the things that we're actually doing for some current clients right now, relative to the social distancing and how we can support the coming back to campus. We kind of wanted to look at the major spaces on campus that students are involved in. And of course, you can read those: learning environments, the classrooms, library, all the different spaces. Workspaces I really didn't want to talk about today, because primarily those are confined to faculty, staff, and of course administration on the campus. But the others, I wanted to talk about each one of the different areas in a little detail to give you some examples of what we're seeing relative to the things we can do to help with these institutions. One of the first things we do is offer the idea of doing a campus utilization analysis. We do these standard practice when we're doing a master plan for a college or university. But certainly here's another time on an institution to review how they're using the existing teaching facilities right now. And I'll share with you a graphic of what that looks like. But obviously on most campuses, faculty like to teach between 9 and about 2. Which means on many campuses, there's a lot of available classroom space if you want to look at spreading your class schedule over the entire day, not just between that narrow window. Other institutions are considering staggered start times, which I think are, they put even more pressure on registrar and scheduling, but the concept is having classes start at the top of the hour, 10 minutes after, 20 minutes after. But of course, you can understand how that kind of blows up a normal schedule, because we all, of course, in terms of you, it would be almost a nightmare trying to schedule around different classes that occur at slightly different times. The one that we've seen a lot of schools embrace right now are this idea potentially of creating these kind of A, B, and C days. And as you'll see from some of the examples, if you really want to stick to the minimum of the CDC guidelines, you really have a reduction with the social distancing of how many students can be in any particular size classroom or teaching space. And so the idea here is having a small portion of a class. Let's say the class in this example would be easy. If you have a 1-hour class that's a Monday, Wednesday, Friday class, a third of the class on Monday attends in person. The other 2/3 of the class watch on whatever platform, could be Zoom like we're doing today, but whatever the platform is for video conferencing. The rest of the class can watch in live time that professor teaching that class to 1/3 of the group. And then of course the other 2 days left in the week, you flip out the students. So for at least 1 day of a week, as a student, you're getting in-person live time teaching, while the others then are watching from their library, it could be a campus center, wherever they're comfortable watching. So we're seeing some consideration for that, combined with even potentially, and of course, part of this is you don't have to pick one of these. Any one of these three all combined could certainly help with scheduling on campus as well. So this is an example of the detailed analysis for a particular institution. They have a number of classrooms, almost 140 classrooms campus-wide. And anything in red, really dark red, is indicating where they're getting close to their limit of almost all classrooms being used on campus. But if you can see how in the middle of the early morning and afternoon, there's a lot of red. But please note there's green on either side of it. And then when you even look later in the afternoon, then we really have a drop-off. So now this brings up the biggest issue is, will faculty, particularly if they're union faculty, want to teach the same class twice or 3 times in the same day? So you wouldn't be doing the A, B, and C scheduling. You'd be doing the same class, Intro to Biology, 3 times on that Monday in the same classroom to 3 different groups of students that are going to move through that class. So that's an issue that will have to be worked out with, of course, registrars, administrations in terms, in this very unique period, having faculty do something like that, which would be very unusual for the faculty. It also works generally for laboratories as well, but those have their own issues because they tend to be team taught. So there's strategy for lab spaces as well. But if we start looking at then what we actually provide for the institutions, the first thing is analyzing the schedule and then analyzing the individual classrooms. Nobody has exactly the same number of identical classrooms on campus. They can all be generally unique in shape and size, number of seats. But that's the first start. We do it for all spaces, not just learning environments, for all the other spaces on campus. We also provide the signage support that goes with that, because one, we're developing these diagrams for each individual classroom so that we know how they should be set up every day. There's no moving of chairs in the space. We're marking the floor. It makes it much easier for physical plant staff to get them set up in the fall. And then it makes it very easy for both faculty, but also custodial staff to make sure that the furniture is not moved around in any space, so we maintain are distancing. Other signs are, of course, ones you've already seen. They're signs about spacing on the floor. They're one-way arrows. You'll see some examples of those. There are other things that we do to describe these spaces. We want these images also posted in the space because we want to make sure both students and also faculty understand the importance of adhering to the outlines and where people sit in these spaces and how they're going to be taught. The last piece is doing a touch point analysis. I won't spend a lot of time on that, but it's an analysis on building by building of how many times a student that's coming into a building needs to touch things to get to their class. And of course, in the perfect world, if you didn't have front doors and you didn't have doors on bathrooms and every fixture, sink, every door open for you automatically, kind of like Star Trek, you walk up, they just open. You could imagine coming into a facility and touching nothing while you're in there, other than when you sit down at the desk that you're going to be sitting in or the table while you're actually in the classroom. So that's another analysis. Many institutions have standards that are already many parts of restrooms and parts of buildings. They're ADA door opening. There are lots of things that already do this for us, but it's kind of making sure that we're catching all the other parts of this. This also speaks to then also how you travel through a building too. One-way stairs going up and going down because stairs tend to be narrow and force students passing each other on a stair. One-way halls, or where we demarcate hallways if they're wide with a line down the middle with, of course, just like we drive, we're going to walk down each side. So there's some other things that can be done on building wide. And so, depending on the campus, in terms of the teaching facilities on a campus, this could be anywhere from 5 to 25 different buildings, but it's a pretty quick analysis to go in and understand what needs to be improved. We did some graphics just for our website to kind of show how the circle of, I call them circle of influence because it sounds terrible to say it's, circle of death or anything like that.
I don't think I would use that.
we don't use that terminology, but it's about this 6 foot distance, which actually really, when you look at the diagrams we create, we look at, while it's a 6 foot, it's a 6 foot radius, 12 foot diameter. So imagine yourself in the middle of a cone or a ball. That's this shape, and you can see in this typical classroom where, if it's your normal 32 seats, professor at the front. This one just happens to have 2 indoor and outdoor exit ways, which is great. But in this case, when you reconfigure it with the social distancing outlines that are on the CDC website, suddenly you're seeing a large reduction in the seating. So when we start to talk about some of these examples, on one campus, we've looked at all their classrooms, and you can see kind of a standard classroom, 38 seats, 1 door, screen on the south end, and you can see this one just happened to be tablet chairs. You can now see those spheres of influence and how they overlap, and so, this is not considered a safe and social distancing situation. There are 2 kind of levels of what the CDC has suggested in terms of social distancing. This, as a graphic, represents kind of the worst case scenario where we really reduce the number of seats. All the way down to 14, we provide walking paths, so you don't have to walk through someone's sphere. And you can see the reduction. This includes, if you're walking down the path, I get into my seat, but I don't go anywhere else. There's another version of this where we eliminate the paths and we add about 5 more chairs, so we can get between 14 and 19. Under that version, now we put it on the onus of both either the faculty or the students themselves, that when they come in, it goes completely against human nature, but the first student in is going to have to sit in the first spot in the first row at the very front. And then you backfill so you never really have to walk past or over or by someone as you fill the classroom. We all know, no different than in class or church, people fill from the back forward. And that's the one thing from a behavioral standpoint, to be able to put more students in these existing spaces, we're going to have to start changing how we fill our classrooms. We'll see how that works, because of course this has not been tested yet in classrooms. For libraries, of course, there have been several different scenarios. One is completely closing libraries on campus. All resources are virtual now, or they almost all are. So that's one opportunity. Of course, that takes off a significant opportunity for students still to study or study close to one another, but again, social distancing is important. And so we've looked at that, but what we're seeing in the library analysis we've been doing, a significant reduction in the number of potential students you can have in these spaces because, typically libraries, because they are about collaboration now and about study and teamwork, they're pretty densely populated, even more so than sometimes some of the classrooms. So this happens to be one of our institutions. This happens to be the second floor of a library, and while it's a small graphic, you can see almost 450 students and faculty staff can fill that floor in this library.
Wow.
Given all the seats. Then you look at what it looks like, if each one, had COVID-19. I mean, it's not a good diagram. When we then do our social distancing, we look at the pathways, one-way walking areas, we separate or reduce the amount of furniture in these spaces. We went from 450 to safely down to a little bit more than 100 students. And so, this will be an issue on campuses, deciding to what extent, do they want to do this? So whether it's a small collaborative space where now instead of 5 or 6 students in that room, you can have 1, maybe 2, to how we move furniture about. So another one of the services, of course, is identifying each piece of furniture or furnishing that's either going to have to be completely removed and stored somewhere, or going to have to be demarcated or marked off so that it won't be used. And again,
that brings up a question, if I might interrupt you, is what are universities, when you talk to universities and do this consulting for them, what are they thinking about all this furniture that has to be marked, identified, tagged, and then stored? Are they looking to storage facilities off campus? Do they have it on campus?
Yes. Well, we've had a couple of different scenarios and strategies. One, we determine for them through our documentation so they know what to take out. So we make it as easy as we can because it's going to fall to physical plant, potentially, those folks, to have to come in and start doing this. But we make it easy because, for every room, we create a list of what stays, what goes. And there are a couple different strategies. One, of course, are somewhere, on campus, of course, renting a significant number of storage units, just rented for the fall semester where they'll go ahead and put these in. Of course, they have to be tagged as well, so they know where they go back to. Another, particularly for some of the academic buildings, if it's a combination of reducing the amount of furniture but also changing the schedule, what we found in some instances is, let's say an academic building might have 20 classrooms in the building. We're talking about moving all the extra furniture stacked and in one of those classrooms. So you lose another classroom, but you stack it full, or you take some of the tiered lecture halls, which are even more difficult to use because of the social spacing and having to climb over to get, because of the fixed seating, and store what you can in those spaces. So they're stored within the building. But that only works, again, if you're going to expand your schedule and pick up those extra teaching spaces because of your schedule. So those are the kinds of conversation. And again, no one has the perfect strategy or scenario. The other one is simply come up with a system by which you tape or cover all of the additional furniture. So in this version, we're at least illustrating that the furniture is removed. That's certainly an option. In this case, they had a large meeting room. It's in the upper right corner. We also suggested meeting room would be offline, and you'll just take all the extra furniture, stack it very carefully. So it's also even on the same floor. Well, that would reduce the seating count, again, even some more, but that's something that just it's a decision that has to be made. In this case also, we have 2 stairs in this building. It's an older building. And we've designated one stair up only and the other one down. Of course, the elevators we've designated to have only 2 riders at the most. It's a large elevator because it's a freight elevator. So even those kind of details have to be looked at very carefully. And then we didn't show the bathrooms, but even bathrooms are suggested that they have a door. We now, because this is an older library, modify the doors so you can use a door pull. You've seen those on the bottom of doors. You can use your foot to open a door. We've also had then toilet facilities and urinals covered and sinks covered so that you can space as well as when you're using even a restroom. So it's a fairly detailed analysis, but it really helps in terms of physical plan, who's going to have to ultimately potentially go ahead and do all this work between now and probably August 15th or whenever your campus is starting up. Student centers offer a whole other series. For today's purposes, we looked at just a couple of faces to share with you. This happened to be one of our clients' campus center, where we wanted to look just at the cafe. You think about still providing the basic services of dining and cafes on campus. Students still want to have their coffee as well as faculty and staff. This cafe was basically has 53 seats and a couple of individuals that actually serve, and you could see the overlap there. So when we did the analysis, now we're down to 13 seats for those who want to stay in the space, but we've created a one-way path in, a one-way path out. Of course, the floor will be demarcated. It'll have the spots that are 6 feet apart, so you don't get too close to the first person who's ordering. And so that's kind of, even in this small piece of this much larger building, that was that quick analysis to give everyone the idea, again, how much furniture needs to move away, and how do we still use this venue. You hate to not offer this to individuals on campus. It's lost revenue, obviously, and you want to keep the daily life as normal as possible under these new conditions in the fall. The other piece we analyzed was the ballroom, and now this is interesting because the idea of having a luncheon or an evening event, sit down, 10-person or 8-person round event with a speaker, dinner served, we think in the fall those probably will not be happening very much. You can see the impact on how close. This one, actually, you could even put more tables in here, but this was the diagram that this particular institution used to set up for those kinds of special events. What we looked at instead was, well, if we take some of our tables and chairs from elsewhere on campus, can we take the ballroom and make it something else? Can it become a large lecture hall now? In replacing that fixed tiered lecture hall that might have been 100 seats, but the number of seats you lose because you have to cross seats, and they're so close together to begin with. What we've done is taken a venue that seats over 100 people for a special event. Now we can safely distance and still get 70 seats in here. They have all the technology in place, so there are multiple projectors available, so you can still have a large lecture session or section for a class, but you do it in your ballroom or other spaces. Think about most campus centers have not just a large ballroom resource, but they'll have a whole series of other sized meeting spaces. And if the idea of meetings, more formal meetings, can be replaced with we're going to have to use it for classrooms, now we have some growth in the classroom schedule as well because we have additional classrooms available for use. Housing is another piece, and of course Alton, you're more familiar with the housing than most. We know you just have to look at it as efficiently as you can because there's a significant amount of revenue to be either lost or gained depending on the decisions as they relate to housing. And so we don't like to think of it about reducing housing options, but we still can analyze the housing for the kitchen spaces, the common areas, the lounges, even laundry spaces. But we've really, from the standpoint of the different room styles, that's kind of a different strategy altogether. I think you shared with me the story about, the first reaction of housing was, we have these 4-person suites, individual rooms for each of the users. Well, we can only have one student in that space. Well, that becomes really untenable from the standpoint of just basic income. Making revenue off the beds. That's a 75% reduction of housing or boarding cost for a campus. We feel, and even, when you look closely at the recommendations for CDC, they're pretty vague, but obviously a student in any one of the 4 rooms, this space should easily support 4 students. They're in their own sleeping area, and it really becomes the issue of the bathrooms and how carefully they're cleaned by the students in those spaces. For the traditional singles, it makes no difference. For triples, we would probably say you shouldn't have triples on campus, but maybe doubles. We have lots of campuses. You know the diagram on the left. It's very common. It's the shared bathroom with two doubles. The beds are far enough apart. They are more than 6 feet apart. You can even change directionally how you lay out the rooms. One of the things that housing staff might need to do, because, again, students move furniture around, they stack beds, they do all kinds of things. There might need to be kind of a furniture review to make sure that for two students to, safely, be in a double like that, somebody's going to have to make sure they haven't pushed the beds together.
Sure.
But
And I would just make a couple of comments on this, is that
Sure.
we would strongly agree. And as you know, we produced a white paper COCM has recently about that. We feel like that, it's really a bathroom issue. If you can limit the number of students who share a bathroom, and if you only have 2 students sharing a bathroom, you really can control that environment much more than a shared bedroom with community bath down the hall. The other thing that I think is interesting is that we're even seeing some recommendations that in the bedrooms where you share, or 2 students are in a bed, you have them sleep at opposite ends, which even further distances the residents.
And I think another thing that plays into this is, you also think about students themselves and how they actually live on a campus. And, some sleep in, some get up early and get right to class, others sleep in, some are night owls. So
different schedules, different class schedules.
Yep, exactly. And so, I don't believe anyone's done any kind of real study as to, how that might look in terms of housing. But certainly, it might be that you're only in the room in a common manner while you're asleep maybe only 4 hours. We don't know. But I think, the housing, I think obviously for parents and for the students themselves, there's a concern. Of course, there are lots of other topics that relate to housing. Some campuses have talked about those who have the antibodies being in one residence hall, those who show they haven't been. All campuses have made generally agreements about testing. So the day you stepped on campus, you get tested. How often that testing occurs after that, I don't know. It'll vary by different institutions. So there's a whole nother higher level of decisions that get to be made by these institutions. But certainly the idea of testing, it sounds a little odd, but you might have, intramural flag football teams that are made up of those who have antibodies and those who don't, and they don't play each other. So there are so many other scenarios and strategies that go beyond just architectural planning. We're just trying to do our best to plan the facilities.
Sure.
And for the last one I wanted to share with you, of course, fitness centers are important. Those gym spaces, I've talked to a lot of recreation directors and athletic directors. This example, by the way, is great. You can see how much space is around all these students. This one doesn't have to be necessarily changed. One thing we've heard for many of the rec directors, they know that in their fitness centers, the density of equipment they know is far too close together. But what they do know they also have are now court spaces that they're not offering intramural basketball because of the contact. They're not offering intramural volleyball. So now they have these courts that are basically available. So in some strategies, de-intensifying the equipment in their fitness centers and moving them potentially to basketball courts. Spreading them out, then there's no issue with distancing. And for today, I won't get into the detail, but for varsity teams, whole nother level of issues and decisions that don't have anything to do with architecture. NCAA, of course, is involved, schedule. There are so many things relating to that. It's unique, but we can still analyze the entire facilities. What we found happened immediately when campuses shut down earlier this spring was, at least recreationally, many of those facilities did online virtual exercise classes. Doesn't work for lifting weights in the weight room, but for any sort of those, everything from Zumba to Pilates to yoga to just dance, any of those kind of aerobic activities, almost everybody went online in terms of offerings. So students still had that available to them, even if they were at home living with their parents because they had to leave campus. So one of our clients sent us, and I just got another email from one yesterday wanting to do the same thing in their athletic facility. This is a mezzanine. I didn't do the whole fitness center because it would be hard to see. But this is a mezzanine in an existing space. It had 37 spaces. You can see they're pushed together. You can see the overlap. And when we really then analyzed it, we went from 37 to 19 stations. We created one-way laps. Again, because this was a mezzanine in a larger fitness center, the stair is one way, and we did have the opportunity, because of exiting, you could exit out as well. So it just, it created this space. What we've seen from the gold gyms, and even from some of the different states and local jurisdictions, they were telling gyms to, of course, socially distance based on what the CDC recommended. And they were saying, well, you can just cover up every other piece of equipment. You can do strategies like that. Problem is, sometimes the equipment is so close together, every other piece will not meet that social distancing. So you really need to look carefully at the individual layouts to make sure that you're abiding by the recommendation. So in this example, you have two options in a fitness center. If you're not going to move equipment to a basketball court, so you keep the same amount of equipment in the building, or to a racquetball court, you've got other places to move it potentially. The other option then is you have to tape and or cover the existing equipment. It doesn't move, but it gets taped off. This example was simply, okay, well, we looked at the taped off version and shared it with them, and they're like, wow, that's kind of a pain. So we did a version also that said, well, if we can move some equipment, you're limited sometimes because some equipment requires a plug, so you can't move some things too far. But this is a version where we took equipment out of the middle, and then we also spaced it so it's properly spaced, and you can get on the equipment safely, and you can have literally 19 people in here all working at these stations at one time. The likelihood of that happening, again, just depends, but we want to prepare for the best. So that's kind of the approach we've been taking with our clients, and of course, more and more of them are reaching out. As I said, I just got an email yesterday. More and more, I think, as our college and universities, these planning teams are getting closer and closer to fall, they're starting to realize the momentous event that they have to tackle. And certainly what we can provide them is taking some of the pressure off of having to kind of create these situations and at least get this off their plate so they can deal with some of the higher level decisions that have to be made relative to school and those kinds of things. So,
well, it sounds like it's a great resource that you all are providing, and you're really helping the universities think through. I mean, I'm sure you would have never thought when you were studying architecture in college that you'd be doing this kind of space planning, but architects are ideally suited for this.
Yeah, we like to think so. And this is just something we're doing. We're assuming across the country there are other architects that are doing the same thing, trying to help. I just, the best, I guess the best compliment, one of our institutions, after we analyzed, I think 150 classrooms, they were just shocked. And they were like, wow, we weren't there yet. They hadn't gotten it in their head yet, but they were going to have to do something like this in the fall. And all this did, and I have to give them credit, they're ahead of the curve. Because, they had we were doing this, 2 or 3 weeks ago for them. And it'll be tweaked a little bit, and then they still have to do signage, and, we have to print out all the graphics and get prepared to move forward. But at the same time, they've got a head start, and they just really, when you talk about reducing from, 100%, classrooms are never usually 100%, but even if classrooms are at 90% and they're reducing by 60%, I mean, that's a significant issue that they're going to be challenged with in the fall. We're here offering our help, and we're happy if anybody can reach out to me or look at the website, reach out via the website.
So and this is fascinating stuff, and thank you for joining us today, because you've given our listeners a lot of things to think about. I think with all the challenges, there's certainly a lot of hope in this, and that there are, as we have seen with every aspect of our lives, it has forced everyone to be very innovative. And it really is, if there is a positive side of this, it really is interesting, the innovation that has occurred through this pandemic. So in closing, what could you say to colleges and universities that might be listening today to give them hope about this process?
Well, I think the first thing I alluded to it would be getting started as early as you can, and I venture every campus has their committees and they're involved in making these decisions as we speak today. But the sooner you can look at the actual physical environment that you're expecting your students to use, I think the better prepared, and I think the comfort level for your students and the parents of those students when they return to campus will be much, much better. That's about the only true advice that I can offer. My hope is that of course, the faster we have a vaccination, the faster we'll be back to kind of our normal lives. But until then, we're going to have to, as you said, innovate and help and come up with strategies to make returning to school as absolutely safe as we can. So. But thank you very much for the opportunity, Alton. It's always good to see you, of course, as well. And, have a great rest of the week.
Great. Thank you, Erik. We've been talking today with Erik Kocher from Hastings Chivetta Architects on Student Housing Matters. And Erik, thank you very much, and all the best to you and everyone at Hastings and Chivetta.
Yeah, thanks very much. You as well.